So the most primary text which introduces existentialism to us is called Being and Time, written by Heidegger, a German philosopher, in 1927. Being and Time is easily available everywhere. It must be in your library at FCCU as well. It's a huge book, and it is a very complex book at the same time. So the book, probably for the first time in history of philosophy, it engages an inquiry into being. Right now, the former philosophical tendencies had been concerned with observing the life and the world and the phenomenon around us. While Heidegger uh, introduced this point that while we as individuals observe the life and the world and the society and the universe, and we deliberate on all those things, we tend to forget that we as individuals are also one of those objects which we study. So the inquiry which is into the world outside, that inquiry should be directed inwards as well. And by inwards, then we mean the inquiry into the being that we all are. So when this inquiry was directed inwards, that then introduced this problem of what we call existence of the being. So now this idea of directing inquiry into the being, that basically was based on another philosopher who came before Heidegger, whose name was Husserl. Now Husserl had already put this project of inquiry into being in another way, not the way Heidegger put it, but Heidegger's own philosophical notion was a development on what Husserl had been doing previously. So this was Husserl's view. According to Husserl, consciousness is our direct openness to the world, one that is governed categorically or normatively rather than causally. That is, intentionality is not a property of the individual mind, but the categorical framework in which mind and world become intelligible. So Husserl brought focus on consciousness, basically. Now, in the Cartesian view of philosophy, I made a few statements about that in the previous class as well. In the Cartesian view of consciousness or philosophy, existence is divided into mind and body. So basically, we have a mind, and that mind operates through senses, and those senses are channel of knowledge, and the knowledge comes from the world around us. Let me just take this person. However, Husserl is deviating from that Cartesian view of philosophy. According to him, it's not that mind operates through the senses. Rather, our consciousness itself is open to the world. And that openness to the world is not causal. And by causal, we mean that it doesn't operate through the law of causation. Some of you might have heard about it, the law of causation. So basically, law of causation is the primary law of science, which claims that for every action there has to be a cause, and without that cause, action is not possible. Many people have, written about it. Many philosophers have written about it. The law of causation is, as I said, is the primary law of sciences. So when Husserl says that our consciousness does not operate through law of causation, rather it is an independent entity which is in direct connection with the world outside. When he says that, basically he is denying the role of our senses in collecting the knowledge from outside. Why so? Because when we say that our five senses are the medium of knowledge, by that we would mean that our eye, for example, is a cause of the observation that we can make. But Husserl is denying that. Similarly, we might say that our ears are cause of whatever we listen. Husserl is again denying that. His view is that the whole existence, including our body, that is conceivable because of consciousness. So it is in fact consciousness which makes everything else possible. That is why we do not need to depend on any law of causation or any scientific exploration in order to understand the world. Rather, consciousness itself is supreme and can think about the life and can think about the world. So if we read some part of this paragraph, a phenomenology of consciousness, it will make the things a little more clear as far as Husserl and then Heidegger is concerned. So a phenomenology of consciousness then explores neither the metaphysical composition nor the causal genesis of things, but the constitution of their meaning, right? So if you pay attention to this term, constitution of the meaning, so basically, the way the writer of this particular reading that I shared with you from the Stanford, so basically he's explaining Husserl's understanding of consciousness to us. So Husserl argued that the existence outside, it does not matter. Why it does not matter? Because the existence outside, existence of anything, any object, the nature, the architecture, whatever is around us, the existence of all those things, that does not matter. Why? Because if we do not have consciousness to perceive, if we do not have consciousness to perceive all the existence around us, if we cannot give a meaning to that existence, then that existence does not exist for us. So the existence of the things around us basically is the consciousness of that existence. It is the consciousness which makes us aware of whatever is around us. If we are deprived of that consciousness, for us, that existence is nowhere. So, therefore, the meaning of the existence is constituted by our consciousness. So, consciousness, therefore, is the supreme reality. And probably consciousness is the only existence over there. Because all of us carry a different consciousness, an individual consciousness, right? Therefore, each one of us, for each one of us, the reality has a different form. The existence have a different form. So depending upon the kind of consciousness we have, the existence around us is different. So existence in itself is nothing. It is the consciousness which is everything. Okay. Now this was Husserl's primary idea. But then how Heidegger develops on it. Let's read the next line over here. Husserl employed this method to clarify our experience of nature, the socio-cultural world, logic, and mathematics, but Heidegger argued that he had failed to raise the most fundamental question, that of the meaning of being as such, right? So, of course, Husserl's thought in its own right was, innovative, but Heidegger points out that Husserl never thought that the consciousness could study, I mean, in addition to the existence outside, consciousness could study the existence inside as well, which is the being, right? So the being is the self. Well, philosophically, there is distinction, but just to make you understand, being is me, or being is you as you are, right? So when you, for example, if I take it, on my own as an individual, and I say that my consciousness makes me aware of what is around me. So what is around me is there not because of its independent existence, but it is there because of my awareness of that, because of my consciousness of that, right? So that is what Husserl had said. But Heidegger pointed out that Husserl did not direct the consciousness towards inwards. That is, I am able to uh, recognize the meaning of the existence around me using my consciousness. But I never thought that I need to direct this consciousness towards my being as well. That I am also existence, right? I am also existence. So I never counted myself among those, uh, objects which are around me. I simply ignored myself, right? So if I apply my consciousness to understand my own being, what will be the consequences of that? Husserl did not explore that. Heidegger did, right? So if we read this part over here, which is highlighted in green, according to the Heidegger, the categories bequeathed by the philosophical tradition for understanding a being who can question his or her being are insufficient. Traditional concepts of a substance decked out with reason, or of a subject blessed with self-consciousness misconstrue our fundamental character, being in the world, right? So Heidegger points out that the previous practices in philosophy, which have been, studying being, they were insufficient, okay? Because they used either the reason to study consciousness, to study being, or they use self-consciousness to study being, but uh, they could not do any justice with it. So basically, what Heidegger wanted to study was, over, this last phrase, being in the world, right? So the previous practices, they, kept themselves Cartesian in the sense that they kept the body out of, they kept the mind out of the rest of the world. So the consciousness, as Husserl has introduced, uh, that almost meant that consciousness is an independent entity, and it withdraws itself from the world which is around us, and thereby it constitutes the meaning of what existence is, right? So it is like, you are holding a camera in your hands. Okay, so camera, when you use camera lens to take a picture, camera does not picture itself, right? Rather, camera pictures what is in front of the lens, right? So camera is like consciousness, and it observes the world around. Now, this is the kind of philosophical understanding of being which we find in the previous philosophy. Heidegger argues that, look, the camera, which is the consciousness or the mind, that camera is also in the world. Camera is also part of the existence, right? So, is there any way to look at the camera and the world simultaneously? Can the consciousness perceive its own consciousness? That is the question. Can my existence, which is I, can my existence recognize my existence, right? So my consciousness does recognize I have a laptop in front of me and I'm teaching my class, but can my mind read my mind, my own mind? Can my consciousness read my own consciousness, right? So being in the world, which is how that consciousness operates in the world, can consciousness study that too? So that is the question Heidegger will raise, and that is what introduces his philosophy to be uh, existentialism, because he brought to forefront the question of existence. He complicated this question of existence, while the previous philosophers, even Husserl, had kind of simplified it by saying that, well, I am consciousness and everything outside me is existence, and it is the consciousness which gives meaning to the existence. That was a simplification of the problem. But Heidegger pointed out, well, the consciousness that I perceive, the consciousness that I have is also part of this world, right? That also is in existence. How can you study that existence, right? How can you study that consciousness? So that is the question. So Heidegger, therefore, truly is called father of modern existentialism, right? Okay, so from here we go to two major thinkers who developed on Heidegger. One is Kierkegaard, and the other one is Nietzsche, right? And the idea that Kierkegaard proposed was that of the single individual. Okay, so let's read some part of Kierkegaard over here. Okay, let's read from here. So in Kierkegaard, the singularity of existence, so that is a concept that Kierkegaard, introduced. The singularity of existence comes to light at the moment of conflict between ethics and religious faith. Suppose it is my sense of doing God's will that makes my life meaningful. How does philosophy conceive this meaning? Drawing here on Hegel as emblematic of the entire tradition, Kierkegaard, in his book Fear and Trembling, argues that for philosophy, my life becomes meaningful when I raise myself to the universal by bringing my immediate natural desires and inclinations under the moral law, which represents my telos, or what I ought to be. In doing so, I lose my singularity, since the law holds for all, but my actions become meaningful in the sense of understandable, governed by a norm. Now, a person whose sense of doing God's will is what gives her life meaning will be intelligible just to the extent that her action conforms to the universal dictates of ethics. But what if, as in case of Abraham's sacrifice of his son, the action contradicts what ethics demands? Kierkegaard believes both that Abraham's life is supremely meaningful. It is not simply a matter of some immediate desire or meaningless tick that overcomes Abraham's ethical consciousness. On the contrary, doing the moral thing is itself, in this case, his tempting inclination. And that philosophy cannot understand it, thus condemning it in the name of ethics. So, God's command here cannot be seen as a law that would pertain to all. It addresses Abraham in his singularity. If Abraham's life is meaningful, it represents, from a philosophical point of view, the paradox that through faith the single individual is higher than the universal. Existence as a philosophical problem appears at this point. If there is a dimension to my being that is both meaningful and yet not governed by the rational standard of morality, by what standard is it governed? For unless there is some standard, it is idle to speak of meaning, right? So, in simple terms, Kierkegaard argued. So, first thing was that Kierkegaard was, you know, developing his arguments based upon Christian faith. Okay? For a long time in Europe and in West, even to some extent today, the source of wisdom was Christian faith. Okay? Right. So Kierkegaard, using some examples from Christian faith, he argues that that when an individual submits oneself to the total faith in God and applies on oneself all the dictates of religion, then that individual loses his own existence or her own existence into those laws, and thereby he loses the singularity of the individual. That individual loses her or her own singularity. Singularity as opposed to universality. So the God's laws are universal. That is what we already know. The laws which are given by God, they are universal. That is why they are divine laws. Okay, so when an individual completely follows those laws, that kind of deprives that individual from his singularity. Why? Because when an individual follows the universally valid divine principles, then those universally valid divine principles, they are for everybody. So following God's path is in a way following what everybody should do. Well, people might not do it, but that is what they should do. So from that perspective, therefore, following the universal laws is like you losing your own singularity. But he would use this interesting example of Abraham sacrificing his son on the command of God, right? And he would notice that when God addressed to Abraham and gave him certain directions, that is a unique case, because the order given to Abraham, the prophet Abraham, the order given to Abraham was only for Abraham and not for everybody else. Therefore, when Abraham completely followed God's dictates, interestingly enough, Abraham did not destroy his singularity. Rather, he maintained his singularity because that order was meant just for him. On the other hand, because Abraham was a true, a follower of God, therefore, generally speaking, he was submitting himself to the divine law That is, you must abide by the orders given by your God. So Abraham therefore appears to be a paradoxical figure, a figure who maintains singularity, at the same time destroys that singularity as an individual. Right now, this is a particular example which Kierkegaard uses from religious metaphors. But then he brings out this example to understand existence in general. And he would say that if you read this last line once again, that as a philosophical problems at existence appears as a philosophical problems right at this point. If there is a dimension to my being that is both meaningful and yet not governed by the rational standard of morality, by what standard is it governed, right? So if I as an individual decide to give a unique meaning to my life by being singular or by maintaining singularity of individuality, then what will I have to do? I will have to say no to all the divine laws, all the universal laws. That is the only way I can maintain my singularity as an individual. Right? But, that way I cannot survive in this world. I must be governed by some laws which are based upon morality. But then what laws those would be? Right? What laws those would be? I mean, uh, so therefore, the challenge that individual faces while seeking the meaning of his existence is this, that on the one hand, an individual can try to maintain her singularity by saying no to all those rational and moral and religious principles which have been given to him by divine. That is the path that an individual can take. But on the other hand, it's not possible to survive or exist by totally denying all those laws, right? Now, this is the paradox, and an individual has to find meaning from within this paradox. And this is the development that we come across in Kierkegaard. Now, Nietzsche would take a step further on that. He proposes a philosophical experiment. So this is a famous phrase by him, God is dead. So he in fact conceptualizes, he breaks the paradox which Kierkegaard was confronting, and he gives that, supposed world, or he imagines that world where God is no more. Thousands of years have passed and people have gradually totally forgotten about God, right? So God is no more. That is the situation. When we say God is no more, by that we mean the divine principles, the moral principles, they are no more. And if they are no more, and you as an individual are left just with this existence, now you have to figure out your own ethics without taking any commands from any higher being. In this situation now, the individual's singularity is totally intact. Kierkegaard was not willing to, give up or deny the divine principles, but he was confronted with this paradox. How to do about it? What to do about it? On the other hand, On the other hand, Nietzsche, he kind of, pushes away that yoke, and then he kind of, confronts the existence as it is. So if we read from here, Nietzsche sought to draw the consequences of the death of God, the collapse of an atheistic support for morality. And if we go on over here, Nietzsche's idea that behind moral prescriptions lies nothing but will to power undermined that authority. So Nietzsche explained the morality, you know, or the religious dictates in an altogether different way. Another phase which is very, very much famous in Nietzsche's philosophy was will to power. And his idea was that all the morality or moral prescriptions that we follow, they are in fact expression of the will to control or the will to power by by higher beings, by the people who are powerful in society. So the people who are powerful in a society, they promote moral prescriptions to control those who are weak. He will explain that further in his book on the genealogy of morals. So on the account given on the genealogy of morals, the Judeo-Christian moral order arose as an expression of the resentment of the weak against the power exercised over them by the strong, a tool used to thwart that power. It had over time become internalized in the form of conscience, creating a sick animal whose will is at war with its own vital instincts. Thus, Nietzsche arrived at Kierkegaard's idea that the crowd is untruth. The so-called autonomous, self-legislating individual is nothing but a herd animal that has trained itself to docility and unfreedom by confronting to the universal standards of morality. The normative is nothing but the normal. And this is a very provocative thought that Nietzsche was giving. So basically, the thought was that all the baggage of morality which humanity has been following for centuries, maybe, that baggage of morality was kind of self-imposed baggage. So the powerful people had, created the moral prescriptions to control the weak people. The powerful people had created the idea of justness, for example, or the idea of morality, or the idea of law and punishment, in order to keep the weaker people under check, so that those weaker people could serve the powerful people in better way, right? Uh, and he would explain it further by saying that for so long, humanity has been put under the baggage of morality that now in 18th 19th century, humanity has reached a point where uh, this will to obey in the weak people, the will to obey has become internalized, and it has turned into what people call conscience, the conscience. And so people have internalized those rules, so to say, and they just follow those rules and those sets of morals and those uh, moral prescriptions. They just follow them as they are, without having to be asked by any external authority. But of course, that authority is constantly there. It is not that it went away. It is there. It is there. It is there in the form of religious scholars. It is there in the form of state. It is there in the form of powerful people in the society, so on and so forth. But he would argue, Nietzsche would argue, that all those morals and all those moral prescriptions, they basically are the principles and rules of the crowd, of the common man, of everyone, right? So there is no greatness in following all those moral prescriptions which everybody is following, right? Rather, that once again is something normative, right? Or something normal. So further he would argue, in his various books, that uh, the true powerful individual is the one who denies all these moral prescriptions and is able to create new moral principles. Okay, that could be a possibility, that could not be a possibility, that is a separate debate, right? But he would call all those people following certain religious injunctions, he will call them sick animals, right? He would say that even if they don't want to follow those moral principles, even if they don't want to follow them, still they follow them. They are constantly suffering a conflict within themselves, the conflict between what they want to do and what they have been asked to do, right? And most of the people, they follow what they have been asked to do, and that is the sign of weakness according to Nietzsche. And we rather need to kind of according to Nietzsche, reverse this order, and we need to appreciate those people who can break away from the conflict and who can just impose or assert their vital instincts. So that is the phrase, a very favorite for uh, Friedrich Nietzsche. Right. So we are still on the question of existence, right? So this is another way to look at existence, and as we observe in Nietzsche, now the focus has been directed. The focus has been directed towards the individual, right? Uh, on the existence of the individual. That what is the situation that individual is experiencing while living in a particular society or while living in this particular world. If we continue with Nietzsche variously, this green highlighted part indicates such a standard in his reference to health, strength, and the meaning of the earth. Perhaps his most instructive indication, however, comes from aesthetics, since its concept of style, as elaborated in the gay science, provides a norm appropriate to the singularity of existence. To say that a work of art. So basically, what Nietzsche argues within the Gay Science, a book written by him, is this. He says that all the works of literature or all the works of aesthetics and art, they have a style. They have a unique style, right? And that style, uh, you know, is not the content, but it is a style which makes every aesthetic piece unique. He would argue that we can apply the similar formula to individuals as well. So for Nietzsche, existence falls under such an imperative of style to create meaning and value in a world from which all transcendent supports have fallen away, is to give unique shape to one's immediate inclinations, drives, and passions. To interpret, prune, and enhance according to a unifying sensibility, a ruling instinct that brings everything into a whole, that satisfies the non-conceptual aesthetic norm of what fits, what belongs, and what is appropriate. So basically, he uses the aesthetic form, you know, he uses the aesthetic form as a standard for the individual existence. So the individual, uh, Nietzsche is not very prescriptive all the time. He does not tell you much, right? But here and there, a few prescriptions that we do get. One of them is this one, that human existence should be reconfigured on the standards of aesthetic form. And what is aesthetic form? Aesthetic form is, a unique way of arranging a particular text, right? It's not about the content, it is about that arrangement. So according to Nietzsche, the individual can also be reorganized, on the level of style, right? Not in terms of the content, but on the level of style. And what happens in the case of style is that each literary piece or each aesthetic piece has a unique style, right? In the same way, if we follow this principle, then each individual would have a unique individuality, right? And if each individual would have unique individuality, then that individuality will retain its singularity, right? So we will have a kind of being who is unique in her or his own